It all began in the middle of summer, when the air was thick with humidity and the neighborhood was buzzing with the low hum of lawnmowers. The subdivision where I owned several rental properties looked like something straight off a real estate brochure. Perfectly trimmed hedges, pastel-colored houses lined up in neat rows, and a homeowners association that prided itself on maintaining harmony. On the surface, it was the picture of suburban perfection. But beneath that glossy veneer was something far less appealing, the iron grip of one woman who thought she controlled it all. She was known simply as Karen. Her presence was felt before it was ever seen. She was the self-appointed enforcer of the HOA every regulation. The person who noticed if a mailbox leaned half an inch too far left, or if a lawn had grown one blade of grass higher than regulation length. Neighbors avoided her at the grocery store. Some even changed their walking routes just to avoid her gaze. Karen thrived on authority, though she had none beyond the little power she squeezed from the HOA board. When my latest tenant moved into one of my properties, Karen noticed instantly. She lived directly across the street, and her blinds became like watchtower slats, her eyes darting through them with military precision. She scribbled notes in a little book, the kind of spiral notebook you'd expect to see in a high school classroom, except hers was filled with the imagined offenses of every family on the block. The tenant, a young professional woman named Emily, seemed like the kind of neighbor anyone would want. Quiet, polite, paid her rent on time. She wasn't throwing parties, leaving trash in the yard, or doing anything remotely disruptive. But to Karen, she was an interloper, a stranger, someone who hadn't been vetted by her unspoken approval process. Karen decided from the very first day that Emily was a problem. It started with little things, a note tucked under Emily's windshield wiper about parking too close to the curb, a notice taped to her door about unsightly recycling bins that were placed at the end of the driveway half an hour before pickup. Karen wasn't acting alone. She used the HOA letterhead to make her attacks look official. For Emily, these notes were confusing and intimidating. She'd never lived in an HOA-controlled neighborhood before. She assumed she had accidentally broken rules and tried to adjust, but adjusting didn't stop the harassment. One morning, the situation escalated. Emily was leaving for work when Karen marched across the street, phone in hand, already recording. She circled Emily's car, narrating loudly about supposed violations, tires touching the grass, a dull front yard light bulb, and even the claim that Emily's flowers were not in approved colors. It was absurd, but Karen's voice carried across the quiet street, drawing curtains open and doors ajar. Neighbors peeked out, but no one interfered. They had seen this show before and knew better than to step in. Karen's theatrics didn't stop there. Within a week, she had filed a noise complaint against Emily for slamming her car door too loudly. She even called the cops one evening, claiming there was suspicious activity at the house because Emily had returned home late from work. The officers quickly realized nothing was wrong, but the damage was done. Emily was shaken, embarrassed, and felt under siege in her own home. For me, as the landlord, the reports trickled in slowly. Emily was hesitant to bother me with what she thought were minor issues. But when Karen had the audacity to stand in Emily's driveway screaming about HOA fines that didn't exist, Emily finally called me in tears. She explained everything, the notes, the harassment, the police call. I listened carefully, already feeling that familiar irritation building in my chest. This wasn't the first time I had dealt with a trouble, some HOA board or a power-hungry neighbor. But this situation was different because Karen had unknowingly picked a fight with the wrong person. I owned multiple homes in that neighborhood. I was on good terms with the HOA board. I wasn't just some absentee landlord trying to squeeze rent out of tenants. I knew the rules, I knew the bylaws, and I knew when someone was overstepping. And Karen had crossed far beyond that line. What Karen didn't realize as she stood smugly at the end of Emily's driveway threatening to report her to the landlord was that I was the landlord. The very person she thought she could intimidate into evicting Emily was the one holding the deed to the house she lived across from. She believed she was the queen of the cul-de-sac, but the crown she wore was made of paper. That night, I sat at my desk, rereading Emily's messages and drafting my own plan. I wasn't going to confront Karen outright, not yet. People like her thrived on confrontation, twisting it into fuel for their sense of superiority. No, I was going to be deliberate. I wanted her to expose herself fully, to show the entire neighborhood who she really was, before I revealed the truth she could never have imagined. For now, Emily was safe. I assured her she had my full support and that Karen's fake fines meant nothing. I told her to document everything, every note, every encounter, every time Karen stepped out of line. Evidence was going to be my weapon, and patience my shield. The storm was brewing, but Karen thought she was still in control. She paraded around the neighborhood like a sheriff in a one-horse town, blissfully unaware that her reign was about to crumble. The real power in that neighborhood didn't sit behind her blinds with a spiral notebook. It sat in my hands in the form of property deeds and HOA influence. And soon, Karen was going to learn a lesson she'd never forget. Because when you try to sabotage someone's life, you'd better make sure they aren't the very person who holds yours in the palm of their hand. The stage was set. The players were in position. And Karen, still basking in her imagined victory, had no idea her downfall had already begun. Summer in the neighborhood turned heavy, not just with heat but with tension. Karen's harassment didn't slow down after her dramatic scene in Emily's driveway. It only grew bolder. It was as if every time Emily refused to react, Karen doubled her efforts, determined to break her spirit. For Karen, this wasn't about enforcing rules anymore. It was about control. The first major escalation happened on a Sunday morning. Emily woke up to find bright orange flyers plastered all over her front door, mailbox, and even taped to her garage. Each flyer announced, in bold capital letters, that she was in violation of multiple HOA codes, and faced immediate fines. The problem: not a single flyer had the HOA official seal or letterhead. They were printed on cheap copy paper, the wording sloppy, and the accusations baseless. The so-called violations ranged from unauthorized garden gnome placement to failure to maintain acceptable car cleanliness. It was laughable, but the intent was malicious. Emily called me in frustration, her voice trembling. This wasn't just about harassment anymore, it was public shaming. Karen had wanted the entire neighborhood to see those flyers. She wanted Emily to feel humiliated, singled out, and ostracized. But Emily wasn't alone, and Karen didn't realize how much damage she was doing to herself with every stunt she pulled. I advised Emily to keep every flyer, take photos, and continue documenting. Then, quietly, I began making calls. I reached out to a couple of people on the HOA board whom I knew personally. Without mentioning Karen by name, I asked if the HOA had issued any warnings to my property or my tenant. The answer was clear: no. Not a single violation had been filed against Emily. That was all I needed to confirm what I already knew. Karen was freelancing her own fake enforcement campaign. But Karen wasn't satisfied with paper threats. She wanted action. A few days later, Emily returned home from work to find her trash cans had been dragged from the curb and overturned across her driveway. Bags had split open, spilling food waste and coffee grounds in the hot sun. It wasn't random vandalism, it was deliberate sabotage, and across the street, from behind her blinds, Karen watched. Still, Emily tried to stay calm. She cleaned up the mess, documented everything, and called me again. Each report she gave me became another nail in the coffin I was building for Karen's credibility. But Karen wasn't done yet. She escalated further, in the one way she thought would scare Emily the most. She called the police again. This time her complaint was more serious. She claimed Emily was running an illegal business from the home, alleging that multiple strange cars came and went late at night. When the officers arrived, Emily was mortified. They questioned her briefly, looked around, and left after realizing the claim was completely false. But for Emily, the damage was emotional. Being treated like a criminal in her own home shook her deeply. For Karen, though, it was just another performance, another attempt to assert dominance. By now, the neighborhood had taken notice. People who once rolled their eyes at Karen's antics were beginning to whisper more openly. The flyers, the driveway scene, the police visits. It was too much, too fast. Even those who used to turn a blind eye began to see that Karen wasn't just a busybody, she was a bully. Meanwhile, I stayed quiet. I didn't confront Karen, didn't storm across the street, didn't give her the satisfaction of a public showdown. Instead, I built my case. I gathered every photo, every flyer, every time-stamped account of her harassment. I spoke with the HOA board again, this time mentioning Karen directly, and discovered that complaints about her had been piling up for years. She wasn't just harassing Emily. She had a long history of targeting anyone who didn't fall in line with her imagined authority. But what made this situation unique, what Karen couldn't possibly know, was that she was harassing someone under my protection. She wasn't just going up against a tenant she thought was defenseless. She was going up against the landlord who owned not just Emily's house, but several in the neighborhood. And more importantly, someone who had leverage with the very HOA board she weaponized against others. Karen's smug confidence grew each day. She strutted through the neighborhood like she owned it, gossiping to anyone who would listen about the troublemaker renter across the street. But the smirks and nods she once received were fading. Neighbors began exchanging looks, silently acknowledging what was happening. Some even started quietly reaching out to Emily, offering sympathetic words or subtle gestures of support. The tide was turning, though Karen was too blinded by arrogance to notice. Then came the breaking point. One evening, Emily found a letter shoved under her door. It wasn't typed. It was scrawled in messy handwriting. The message was clear and menacing. "You don't belong here. Leave before things get worse." That letter was the final straw. It wasn't just HOA harassment anymore. It was intimidation bordering on a threat. Emily sent me a photo of it immediately, her hands shaking so badly the image was blurry. This time, I didn't just reassure her. I promised her something concrete. Karen's days of terrorizing her were numbered. What Karen didn't realize was that every move she made, every stunt she pulled, was tightening the noose around her own reputation. The more evidence we had, the stronger our position became. She thought she was pushing Emily toward breaking her lease. What she didn't know was that she was building the case that would not only protect Emily, but also expose Karen to consequences she had never imagined. As I organized the folder of evidence late into the night, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of anticipation. Karen had no idea how close she was to disaster. She thought she was untouchable, the queen of her cul-de-sac. But soon she was going to discover the truth, because the landlord she kept threatening to report Emily to wasn't some distant figure. It was me. The very person she had underestimated, the person she had mocked in her self-righteous rants, was the one holding the keys not only to Emily's house but to Karen's entire downfall. The neighborhood was watching, the evidence was mounting, and Karen was walking straight into a trap of her own making. The neighborhood's carefully curated calm was beginning to unravel. While Karen strutted around as if she were the sheriff of the cul-de-sac, the cracks in her power were showing. People who once tolerated her antics now saw her for what she was, a woman obsessed with control, grasping at authority she didn't have. Yet in her mind, she was still untouchable. She had no idea that with every note, every flyer, every call to the police, she was building the very case that would destroy her. I spent the following week gathering and organizing. My folder on Karen was no longer just a set of screenshots and photos. It was becoming a full-blown dossier. Each harassment flyer was cataloged, every threatening note scanned, each police visit logged with dates and times. I also had Emily keeping a daily journal of Karen's actions. The once quiet neighborhood drama had turned into a legal record, and the more Karen raged, the stronger my position became. But evidence alone wouldn't be enough. People like Karen thrived on bluster. If I confronted her too early, she'd twist the narrative, play the victim, and maybe even find sympathy among the few neighbors who still believed her. No, this had to be precise. I wasn't interested in a shouting match. I wanted Karen to trap herself. The first part of the plan was patience. I told Emily to continue her life as normally as possible, No moving her car just because Karen complained, no altering her garden for Karen's approval, no giving in to the intimidation. Every time Karen acted out and Emily didn't fold, Karen grew angrier. That anger fueled reckless behavior, and reckless behavior left evidence. Sure enough, Karen's frustration boiled over. Late one night, Emily texted me, whispering through fear as she typed. She'd caught Karen in the act, lurking around her driveway, snapping photos of her license plate, even trying to peek into her car windows. Emily had filmed the entire thing from her upstairs window, the timestamp glowing in the corner of the video. It was the perfect addition to our growing file, proof of stalking behavior. By now, even the HOA board could no longer ignore Karen's antics. I scheduled a discreet conversation with two board members I knew well. I didn't dump everything on them yet, but I let them know that one of their residents was abusing the HOA name to target my tenant. Their faces tightened as I spoke, and I could tell this wasn't the first complaint they'd heard about Karen. They admitted they'd received numerous neighbor complaints in the past but hadn't taken official action yet. That was about to change. Still, I held back the final card because what Karen didn't know, the part that would freeze her in her tracks, was that I wasn't just Emily's landlord. I was also her landlord's landlord. I owned the very roof under which Karen slept. Her house wasn't her kingdom. It was one of my properties. She had spent weeks harassing a tenant, not realizing she herself lived under the authority of the very person she was attacking. And when the time was right, that truth was going to hit her like a freight train. The next step was subtle. I asked Emily to remain polite but firm whenever Karen approached. No shouting, no retaliation. Just calm indifference. This drove Karen wild. She wanted drama, wanted to see fear, wanted a reaction. Instead, she got silence and composure. That silence echoed louder than any argument could. Predictably, Karen's behavior spiraled. She began spreading rumors in the neighborhood, telling anyone who'd listen that Emily was behind on rent, that she was one warning away from eviction, that the landlord was already looking for new tenants. Neighbors nodded politely, but fewer and fewer believed her. And I made sure Emily knew that no matter what Karen said, her lease was safe. She wasn't going anywhere. Finally, Karen made her biggest mistake yet. In a fit of arrogance, she drafted a fake HOA violation notice and mailed it directly to me. The letter demanded that I remove the problem tenant or face HOA legal action. It was laughable, poorly written, full of typos, and completely fraudulent, but that single envelope was the golden ticket. It proved beyond any doubt that Karen had crossed from petty harassment into impersonation and fraud. That was the moment I knew the trap had closed. Karen thought she was cornering Emily, but in reality, she had just handed me the final piece I needed. Now, not only did I have a record of harassment, intimidation, and stalking, but I also had physical proof of her forging HOA correspondence. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I let her stew in her false sense of victory, watching as she strutted around the neighborhood bragging about the official notice she'd sent. Emily continued documenting, neighbors kept whispering, and I quietly prepared for the reveal. When the curtain finally lifted, Karen wasn't just going to be embarrassed. She was going to be exposed. The neighborhood would see her for what she was. The HOA would have no choice but to act. And Karen herself would be forced to confront the truth she had so arrogantly ignored. Because soon, she was going to learn the one detail that would flip her world upside down. The tenant she tried so hard to destroy was protected by the one person she couldn't bully, her landlord, and worse, her landlord's landlord. The neighborhood had grown restless. Karen's presence loomed larger than ever, but her influence was slipping like sand through her fingers. Every new stunt she pulled only added weight to the pile of evidence I was building. The neighbors had begun whispering more openly now, their patience wearing thin. The woman who once commanded fearful respect was transforming into a spectacle, a cautionary tale unfolding in real time. But Karen still believed she held the reins. She strutted across lawns, clipboard in hand, barking about violations that no one else cared about. She bragged loudly about the letter she had mailed me, convinced she had forced me into action. In her mind, Emily's eviction was imminent. She was already celebrating a victory that wasn't hers to claim. Meanwhile, I stayed silent, watching and waiting. Karen didn't know it, but she was about to walk headfirst into her own undoing. The timing was perfect when the HOA scheduled their quarterly meeting. It was one of those routine gatherings where board members reviewed maintenance budgets, landscaping contracts, and resident concerns. Normally, few people attended, but this time word had spread. Neighbors had seen too much, heard too many rumors, and they wanted answers. For the first time in years, the meeting hall was full, and at the center of it all, sitting proudly with her binder of violations, was Karen. I didn't walk in with drama. I sat quietly near the back, my folder of evidence neatly organized. Emily wasn't there. I had told her to stay home not because she wasn't welcome, but because this wasn't her battle to fight. It was mine. The meeting moved along with routine items, and then came the moment for resident concerns. As expected, Karen seized the floor. She stood, chin raised high, and launched into a tirade about Emily. She described her as disruptive, claimed she was running a business from the home, and waved her stack of violation notices as if they were gospel. The board listened politely, though I noticed the tightness in their jaws, the exhaustion in their eyes. They had heard this song before. When she finally finished, basking in the sound of her own voice, I raised my hand. Calm, measured, deliberate. The room shifted, heads turned. Karen's smirk faltered just slightly, as if she hadn't expected anyone to challenge her. I stood and introduced myself, not as Emily's landlord, but as a property owner in the neighborhood. Then I began laying out the evidence. Slowly, methodically, I presented the flyers, the photos of trashed driveways, the timestamps of police visits, and finally, the handwritten threat note. Gasps rippled through the room as the stack of harassment grew taller. Karen's face flushed red, her lips pressed thin, but I wasn't done yet. The final piece was the fraudulent letter, the one Karen had mailed directly to me, posing as the HOA. I placed it gently on the table in front of the board members. Their expressions hardened instantly. Forgery wasn't just petty drama. It was a serious offense. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the shifting of papers. Then, with deliberate calm, I spoke the words Karen had never expected to hear. I revealed that I wasn't just some landlord defending a tenant. I was also Karen's landlord. Her reaction was immediate and visceral. The color drained from her face, her bravado evaporating in an instant. The room, filled with neighbors who had suffered under her tyranny for years, fell utterly still as the truth sank in. Karen had spent weeks harassing someone under my protection, all while living in a house she rented from me. For the first time, Karen had nothing to say. No bluster, no accusations, no manufactured rules. She froze, her eyes darting nervously as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. The board members exchanged looks, their decision already forming. The neighbors murmured, some smirking, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The woman who had tormented the entire subdivision had just been unmasked, her power shattered in the span of minutes. But I wasn't cruel. I didn't gloat, didn't raise my voice, didn't humiliate her further than she had already humiliated herself. I simply laid out the facts, made it clear that the harassment would no longer be tolerated, and assured the board and the neighbors that I would be taking action as both a landlord and a property owner. The meeting moved on, but Karen's silence was deafening. She sat rigid in her chair, her binder of violations, now exposed as nothing more than props in a failed performance. That night, word spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. People who had once avoided Karen now spoke freely about her downfall. Doors that had remained closed opened to share stories, laughter, even relief. The stranglehold she had maintained on the community was gone, and in its place was a sense of collective freedom. But while the reveal had shattered Karen's illusion of control, the story wasn't over. She wasn't the type to surrender quietly. Her pride was wounded, her image broken, and I knew she would retreat to her blinds, stewing in humiliation, plotting her next move. What she didn't realize was that the consequences were only just beginning, because being exposed in a meeting was one thing. Facing the reality of her lease, her home, and her position in the neighborhood was something else entirely. And as her landlord, I held the final card. The fallout from the HOA meeting spread faster than wildfire. By the next morning, Karen's reputation, once cemented by fear and intimidation, was reduced to whispers and ridicule. Neighbors who had tiptoed around her now exchanged knowing glances, shaking their heads whenever she passed. The self-proclaimed enforcer of rules had been stripped bare, and the neighborhood was savoring every second of it. But Karen herself was not the type to accept defeat gracefully. Humiliation had curdled into bitterness, and bitterness into a dangerous kind of desperation. She retreated behind her blinds more often, her notebook clutched tighter than ever, watching Emily's every move like a hawk. Yet, the power she once flaunted so freely was gone. The HOA no longer entertained her fabricated complaints. The board had officially dismissed her letters as fraudulent, warning her not to misuse their name again. Even the police, now familiar with her false reports, grew impatient. The next time she called, claiming Emily's porch light was disturbing the peace, the responding officer barely hid his irritation. It was clear Karen's credibility with law enforcement was shot. Meanwhile, I was preparing the real consequences. The truth of our landlord-tenant relationship had stunned her into silence at the meeting, but it was time to make that truth concrete. As her landlord, I had the authority to call her out not just as a neighbor, but as a tenant in violation of her lease. I pulled her rental file and began reviewing it with fresh eyes. Late payments, small but persistent complaints from past inspections, and now the mountain of harassment evidence. Her tenancy wasn't spotless. Combined with her behavior toward Emily, I had more than enough leverage to take action. But eviction wasn't my immediate goal. I didn't want to drag the process into a month-long legal battle. What I wanted was accountability. What I wanted was for Karen to finally understand the weight of her actions, not just in the court of neighborhood opinion, but in the reality of her housing security. So I drafted a formal notice. It wasn't an eviction, not yet. It was a warning letter, citing harassment of neighbors, impersonation of the HOA, and violation of the community's peace as reasons for potential lease termination. I laid it out plainly: one more incident, and her lease would not be renewed. If she continued, I would pursue legal action. Delivering that letter was a moment I'll never forget. I walked across the street on a bright, ordinary afternoon. Karen, perhaps sensing the shift in the air, was already perched on her porch, feigning indifference. When I handed her the envelope, her mask slipped. She didn't speak, but her face twisted through a dozen emotions: confusion, disbelief, rage, and finally, fear. She opened it right there, eyes darting across the page, and for the first time, she saw in writing what I had said aloud at the meeting. I wasn't just a landlord. I was her landlord, and her home wasn't as secure as she had always believed. The neighborhood noticed. People peeked through curtains, some even stepping outside under the guise of checking mail or watering plants. They saw Karen's composure crumble as she clutched the paper, her hands trembling. It was the image they had been waiting years to see, the so-called queen of the cul-de-sac reduced to silence, her crown stripped by her own arrogance. For the next several days, Karen was quieter. She avoided confrontation, no longer storming across lawns or plastering flyers. But silence doesn't always mean surrender. I could see it in the way she lingered at her window, the way she scurried to her car with her notebook tucked under her arm. She wasn't done, not yet. Her pride wouldn't allow her to simply bow out. And then, true to form, she made one last desperate play. Late one evening, Emily heard noises outside her house. She peeked through the blinds and caught Karen again. This time, not just snooping, but pulling at the edge of her mailbox, as if trying to pry it open. Emily recorded the whole thing, her phone shaking in her hands. By the time Karen noticed the light flicker from the upstairs window, it was too late. She scurried back across the street, but the evidence was undeniable. When Emily sent me the video, I knew the final chapter had written itself. Karen had crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. This wasn't just harassment anymore. It was trespassing, tampering, a violation that carried legal weight. The next morning, I made the call. I informed the HOA board, who immediately backed me up. I contacted law enforcement, providing them with the video evidence. And finally, I served Karen with a formal notice of non-renewal of her lease. Her time in that house was over. The neighborhood felt the shift almost instantly. Where there had once been tension, now there was relief. People smiled more freely, waved openly to Emily, even gathered in small groups to chat without fear of Karen's looming interruptions. It was as though a storm had finally passed, leaving behind fresh, clear air. Karen, however, reacted just as I expected, angrily, loudly, desperately. She shouted from her porch about conspiracies, about unfair treatment, about being the true protector of the neighborhood. But no one listened anymore. Her audience was gone. The blinds stayed shut, the doors stayed closed, and her words fell flat in the empty air. The power she once held had vanished, replaced by silence and isolation. Her days in that house were numbered, and soon Karen would learn the harshest truth of all. When you spend your life trying to sabotage others, eventually you end up sabotaging yourself. The end came slowly for Karen, not in one dramatic explosion, but in a steady unraveling of the life she thought she controlled. Once the notice of non-renewal was delivered, the countdown began. The house she had lorded over from her porch, the street she had policed with her notebook, the neighbors she had terrorized, none of it would belong to her anymore. The neighborhood felt the change almost immediately. Where once there had been tension whenever she stepped outside, now there was only indifference. Her neighbors no longer flinched at her presence. They didn't lower their voices or glance nervously when she walked by. Instead, they carried on with their lives, smiling at Emily, greeting each other warmly, ignoring Karen altogether. For a woman who thrived on attention, the silence was louder than any argument. Karen tried to fight it at first. She sent emails to the HOA board, rambling pages filled with accusations and conspiracies. She claimed she was the victim of harassment, that Emily had orchestrated everything, that I had fabricated the evidence. But the board, weary from years of dealing with her antics, didn't take the bait. They filed her complaints away without response, unwilling to indulge her anymore. Her next attempt was more desperate. She posted signs in her own yard, handwritten messages warning the neighborhood about corruption in the HOA and landlords abusing power. Neighbors laughed quietly as they walked by, shaking their heads. Once, those kinds of stunts might have stirred fear. Now they only confirmed what everyone already knew. Karen's grip on reality had slipped. Meanwhile, Emily flourished. Freed from constant harassment, she began to enjoy her home. She planted flowers in her front yard, hosted small gatherings with friends, and no longer hesitated to wave at neighbors. For the first time since moving in, she felt like she truly belonged. And the neighborhood embraced her, relieved to have someone kind and respectful across the street instead of a tyrant. As the weeks passed, Karen's bitterness grew. She stopped leaving her house during the day, venturing out only late at night, skulking between her car and her front door, as if the shadows could shield her from the stares she imagined. The once busybody who had controlled the cul-de-sac now lived as a recluse in the very place she had tried to dominate. When moving day finally arrived, it was almost anticlimactic. A rental truck pulled up, its engine rumbling in the quiet morning air. Karen emerged, her face tight and drawn, avoiding the gazes of the neighbors who peeked discreetly from behind curtains. She loaded her belongings with hurried movements, boxes clutched against her chest, as though shielding them from judgment. No one helped, no one offered water, conversation, or sympathy. She had burned every bridge, alienated every potential ally. The woman who once claimed to be the guardian of the neighborhood left it in silence, her exit marked only by the sound of cardboard scraping across pavement and the slam of a truck door. From my porch, I watched the truck pull away. There was no satisfaction in seeing her go, only a quiet sense of closure. The storm had passed. The damage she had tried to inflict had failed, and the neighborhood could finally breathe again. Emily stood in her yard, sunlight catching the flowers she had planted, and waved at me with a smile of gratitude. That was enough. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood transformed. Without Karen's constant interference, neighbors grew closer. Children played freely in front yards. Families gathered on porches, and the HOA meetings returned to calm discussions about landscaping and budgets instead of endless tirades about imagined violations. Karen's name became little more than a cautionary tale, a story whispered to newcomers about the woman who once thought she controlled everything but lost it all because of her own arrogance. As for Emily, she renewed her lease, more confident than ever that she had found not just a house, but a home. She knew she had been tested, and she had come out stronger. And she knew she wasn't alone. Her landlord had stood by her, not as a distant figure, but as someone who valued fairness over fear. And me, I had learned something too. Landlords often get painted as detached, uncaring, or opportunistic. But this time, I had seen first, and how much damage unchecked harassment could cause, and how important it was to protect those who trusted me with their home. Property ownership wasn't just about investments or contracts. Sometimes it was about standing up to bullies who thought they were untouchable. In the end, Karen's downfall wasn't caused by me or Emily or even the HOA. It was caused by Karen herself. Every flyer, every fake violation, every call to the police. Each was another step toward her own undoing. She sabotaged her reputation, her relationships, and finally, her home. The queen of the cul-de-sac had lost her crown, her throne, and her kingdom, all because she underestimated the very people she thought she controlled. And for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like what it was always meant to be, a community